At the 2026 U.S.-China summit, the most the most dangerous message sent by Xi Jinping to Donald Trump actually wasn't about artificial intelligence.
No, not at all.
And it wasn't about tariffs either. It was, well, it was this invisible threat that is literally 2.5 millennia old. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking the massive stack of sources surrounding that summit, the polished speeches, the diplomatic readouts, all that intense media coverage.
Yeah.
And we're decoding the really subtle high-stakes standoff hiding just beneath the surface.
Right, because while most of the news outlets were, they were super focused on the visible theater of it all, the military exercises and the trade agreements.
Yeah, the stuff that makes good headlines.
Exactly. But our materials point to a diplomatic landscape that is entirely different. When you look past those standard political talking points, that 2026 summit really serves as a masterclass in psychological signaling.
Okay, let's unpack this. And as we do, I think it's worth noting right up front that our goal today isn't to validate domestic politics or take sides with either Washington or Beijing.
Definitely not.
Right. We are looking purely at the geopolitical architecture. We're using the historical frameworks from our sources to just figure out how this power dynamic actually works in reality.
Yeah, and to really wrap our heads around the behavior of the United States and China today and to decode what was actually happening in that room, we have to use a framework that was revived by the political scientist Graham Allison.
Right.
We have to look at the Thucydides Trap. As the sources point out, Allison's framing of this trap is, well, it's the crucial lens here. We are analyzing that classic Athens and Sparta dynamic.
The original rivalry.
Exactly. The entire concept hinges on this very specific observation from the ancient historian Thucydides regarding the Peloponnesian War. He wrote, and I'm quoting the sources here, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable."
Okay, wait, but saying war is just inevitably going to happen because, an ancient historian said so. That feels like a massive cop-out for modern leaders.
Does sound like one, yeah.
Aren't we just handing them a convenient excuse for a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Mm.
If both sides just assume, well, we're going to fight eventually, they're basically guaranteeing a disaster, right?
And that tension you're feeling, that is the core of the problem. The mechanism of the trap isn't simply about one country physically building more ships or hoarding more gold than the other. It is fundamentally about the psychology of displacement.
The fear of losing your spot.
Yes. The established power, whether that's Sparta centuries ago or, the British Empire watching Germany industrialize in the early 20th century or the United States looking at China today, that power feels a profound systemic anxiety.
Because everything they built is suddenly at risk.
Right. Their global influence, their security architecture, the very international rules they wrote, they feel threatened simply by the fact that another state is growing.
It's like two people in a shrinking room. The established power feels the walls closing in just because the rising power is taking deeper breaths.
That's a great way to put it.
The rising power hasn't even thrown a punch, right? But their mere expansion feels like a direct attack on the other guy's oxygen.
That captures the friction perfectly. Because the rising power feels it deserves more breathing room, right? More respect, a larger say in the rules of the international system, which is commensurate with its new economic and military weight.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Exactly. But when the established power refuses to yield that space out of fear, the rising power feels artificially contained. They feel disrespected. And that psychological friction, the paranoia on one side and this deep resentment on the other, that is the invisible guest that dictated the entire mood at the 2026 summit.
So if the U.S. is aggressively trying to maintain its primacy, and China views that as illegitimate containment, the actual mechanics of their physical meetings take on massive significance.
Huge significance. Every little detail matters.
Right, because looking at the sources, the contrasting worldviews were literally embedded in the physical reality of the room in 2026. Donald Trump projected a posture heavily rooted in immediate economic pressure and nationalism, demanding America remain number one.
Yeah, very overt.
He framed the whole relationship around leverage, demanding immediate compliance on trade imbalances, intellectual property, things like that.
While Xi Jinping projected an aura of intense strategic patience, Chinese political messaging, it frequently operates through indirect historical references and this really highly orchestrated symbolism.
But it's never just a speech.
Never. According to the diplomatic readouts we're analyzing, this wasn't just about the words spoken at the podium, it was the visual framing. The sources detail how Xi's delegation consistently utilized staging that emphasized absolute parity.
Like the table arrangements.
Yes. There were subtle details, like ensuring the delegations were seated at a perfectly symmetrical round table rather than, a rectangular one with a designated head. And they utilized backdrops that minimize bilateral flags in favor of broader, more global imagery.
Oh, wow. So it was a calculated move to visually dilute American primacy. He's setting the stage to basically say, we are peers now. You don't sit at the head of the table anymore.
What's fascinating here is that Xi didn't need to pound his fist on the table or issue these overt ultimatums. He used terms in his speeches like multipolarity, mutual respect, and non-interference.
Which to a casual observer just sounds like standard, harmless diplomatic filler, right?
Exactly. But structurally, within the context of the Thucydides Trap, it is a quiet demand that the United States accept a shared global leadership. Xi's government repeatedly emphasizes national rejuvenation and achieving total technological independence to finally close the book on what Beijing historically calls the century of humiliation.
Right. It really comes down to fundamentally different timelines. It's it's like comparing a company that organizes its entire strategy around the next quarterly earnings report, or, in geopolitical terms, the 4-year U.S. election cycle.
Yeah, very short-term thinking.
Right. Comparing that to an entity executing a 50-year master plan. China operates as a civilization state, preparing to basically inherit the global order. They aren't trying to win the news cycle, they are trying to win the century.
And by asserting that time is on China's side and that the global balance of power is shifting organically, Xi is triggering the Thucydides trap without firing a single shot.
Because it hits right at that psychological displacement we talked about.
Precisely. Trump's worldview requires unquestioned American dominance, and Xi's subtle messaging suggests history will no longer permit that outcome indefinitely.
Which means we really have to look at why this specific rivalry terrifies Washington so much more than past conflicts. Because, the United States has faced massive existential threats before.
Oh, absolutely. But to the United States, China represents a uniquely unsettling, unprecedented rival.
How so?
Well, think about the Cold War. The Soviet Union had incredible military might, right? A massive nuclear arsenal. But their economic engine was fundamentally broken.
Right, they were isolated.
They simply couldn't compete in the global marketplace, meaning they could never truly threaten American economic supremacy.
And then you jump to the 1980s, and you had Japan. There was massive economic rivalry there. They were dominating global electronics, buying up prime American real estate.
The panic over Japan was real.
It was. But they had no real military ambition. They existed entirely under the U.S. security umbrella, completely dependent on the American Navy to protect their supply chains.
Right. But China possesses both of those threat profiles simultaneously. They are the Soviet military threat and the Japanese economic threat rolled into one and then scaled up to a population of over 1 billion people.
That is a terrifying combination for an established power.
It is. But the sources highlight that it is the actual mechanisms of this power that cause such systemic anxiety. Take their immense global infrastructure influence. It isn't just about building bridges or roads in developing nations.
It's about leverage.
Deep financial leverage. By funding critical ports and telecom networks across the globe, China can effectively rewrite the rules of international trade and data flow. And that makes traditional U.S. naval dominance less economically relevant.
Wow. So they are actively changing the plumbing of the global economy.
Exactly.
Which totally explains why we are seeing such aggressive counter moves dominating the news right now. The intense trade wars, the sweeping technology bans, all those semiconductor restrictions, these aren't just isolated economic disputes.
No, they're highly coordinated.
They are modern siege tactics.
Yeah.
The U.S. is pulling every lever of statecraft to slow down that expansion and protect its foundational architecture.
And from Beijing's perspective, those exact actions completely validate their resentment.
Oh, sure.
When the United States blocks access to advanced microchips, it looks like a desperate attempt by the ruling power to stifle a rising nation's rightful place in the world. It proves to them, in their eyes, that America will not peacefully accommodate their rise.
So there has to be a physical breaking point where these two ideologies actually collide. The economic tension is global, obviously, but the geopolitical friction is deeply localized. And looking at the sources, that physical flashpoint is undeniably Taiwan.
Without a doubt. The contrast in how Washington and Beijing view Taiwan is the most volatile element of this entire dynamic.
Because they see it completely differently.
Completely. To the United States, Taiwan is a crucial democratic partner and a really vital strategic anchor in the Pacific. Its position is critical to the defense lines of allied nations like Japan and the Philippines.
But to China, Taiwan isn't just a strategic asset on a map. It is an inseparable part of Chinese territory. It's a core national interest tied directly to the legacy of the current leadership.
Yes, Xi Jinping has stated repeatedly that reunification with Taiwan is inevitable.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is just increasing military coordination and weapon sales in the region. So I have to ask, what does this all mean for Taiwan? If both sides clearly see the stakes and both know how devastating a conflict would be, why can't they just engineer a strategic stalemate?
We have to look back at the psychology of deterrence that we discussed earlier with Athens and Sparta. Wars between great powers rarely begin because leaders actively want a global catastrophe.
Right. Nobody wants World War III.
Exactly. They begin because both sides back themselves into a corner where compromising or even just hitting pause signals a fatal weakness. If China backs down on Taiwan, the leadership sacrifices immense domestic credibility regarding that national rejuvenation we talked about. It would look like submitting to Western containment.
And if the U.S. backs down, it signals to every ally in the Pacific that American security guarantees are worthless. It effectively yields the entire hemisphere to Beijing's sphere of influence.
Neither side believes it can afford to blink. They become prisoners of their own strategic narratives. And that leads directly into the psychological warfare. Our sources emphasize the weaponization of the concept of inevitability.
There's that word again.
Yes, China pushes this narrative constantly. The inevitability of its rise, its technological supremacy, and the concurrent, unavoidable decline of the American system.
And the brilliance of that narrative is that whether it is mathematically true or not is almost irrelevant.
Totally irrelevant.
Right.
Repeating it serves a massive dual purpose. Domestically, it galvanizes the population with a sense of historical momentum, making them willing to endure economic hardships for this long-term vision.
And internationally.
It applies immense psychological pressure. Projecting the image of a civilization that can simply outlast short-term American political cycles is incredibly intimidating. Dominant powers historically overestimate their permanence, while rising powers cultivate patience.
But let's bring this down to earth for a second, because it is very, very easy to listen to a deep dive about hegemons and geopolitical architecture and think, well, this is just a chess game played by people in suits in Washington and Beijing.
Right.
Why does this ancient Greek trap matter to you, the listener, right now?
Because the stakes for everyday life are immediate and profound. We aren't just talking about abstract policy or distant military posturing. A confrontation, even a purely economic one, fundamentally reshapes your daily reality.
Yeah, the sources lay out the domino effect incredibly clearly. A severe escalation hits global energy prices immediately.
Day one.
The supply chains that literally deliver the modern world would just fracture. We were talking about the mechanisms that build everything from your smartphone to your car. They rely on raw materials and manufacturing hubs that would suddenly be entirely inaccessible. You would see massive structural inflation.
And beyond just consumer goods, the financial markets would be turned upside down. We could see a massive shift in internet freedom and communication capabilities as the digital world splits into competing, incompatible ecosystems.
Like two separate internets.
Exactly. And the entire trajectory of artificial intelligence development would be increasingly weaponized. You'd have two isolated spheres racing to out-innovate the other without any shared ethical guardrails or safety protocols.
The truly sobering part is that all of those disruptions can happen without a single shot ever being fired. A complete economic decoupling of the world's two largest economies would permanently alter daily life across the globe.
So are we just waiting for the trap to spring? Is it hopeless?
No, history is not destiny. Not every rivalry ends in catastrophe.
Okay, good.
I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union navigated decades of terrifying nuclear tension without entering a direct hot war. And today, the economic interdependence between the U.S. and China is profound.
They need each other. Exactly. That shared economic architecture, the fact that their financial systems and manufacturing bases are so deeply intertwined, creates massive incentives for restraint.
Because nobody wants to purposefully detonate their own economy.
Right. But maintaining that peace seems to require a fundamental shift in how both countries define winning.
What does that look like?
Well, America would have to accept a world where it is no longer the sole, unquestioned superpower. It would have to learn to share the global stage, operating as a peer rather than the sole architect of the international system.
That's a tough pill to swallow. And what about China?
China would need to exert its growing influence without seeking coercive expansion. They would have to rise within a framework that doesn't constantly terrify their neighbors. If we connect this to the bigger picture, achieving that balance requires political space for compromise. Leaders need room to negotiate without looking weak.
But the sources note that nationalism is intensifying simultaneously in both nations right now.
Yes. And nationalism narrows the off-ramps. It treats compromise as treason.
Which brings us right back to the silent signals of the 2026 summit. It serves as a stark acknowledgement that the ground under our feet is moving. We started today looking at the surface-level optics of a political meeting. The handshakes, the perfectly arranged tables, the speeches.
The theater of it all.
Right. But by digging into the sources, we uncovered a textbook manifestation of the Thucydides Trap. It is a high-stakes psychological standoff between an established power, terrified of losing its primacy, and a rising civilization state projecting the inevitability of its own ascent.
It is the oldest script in the geopolitical playbook, but it's playing out with the most modern and destructive tools humanity has ever possessed. It really is testing whether we can recognize the patterns of the past before we are condemned to repeat them.
Absolutely. But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder on your own, something that builds on the reality of the global economy we just discussed. We talked about how economic interdependence is one of the few powerful guardrails keeping the peace right now. It's the main difference between this rivalry and the Cold War. But as both nations aggressively pursue total technological independence, especially in crucial fields like artificial intelligence and advanced semiconductor manufacturing, what happens to the Thucydides trap when those economic safety nets finally vanish? If the US and China successfully decouple their core technologies and no longer actually need each other to survive, does the trap finally snap shut?
It's a terrifying question.
It really is. Ethan, so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, look for the deeper history beneath the daily news, and we'll catch you next time.